Hi, I'm Leslie Farr, and welcome to Rome of the West. Today in studio we have Mr. John Treanor, Vice Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Springfield and a member of the Tolton Commission. So, like with most of our people in history, there's some things out there, some true and not true. So from what I understand, you've been heavily into the research of Father Tolton, and you've uncovered some things that, that will correct the records because, some stuff is maybe not necessarily intentionally misleading, but it's not historically accurate. So why don't you run us through some of the things that you've discovered?
Well, it's great to be here. It is a real exciting time in a storyline that is essentially correct. The historians wrote, and this was from mostly secondary sources, that Father Tolton was born a slave.
Yes, sir.
And he was. As a matter of fact, he was at least a third-generation Catholic slave in this country, fairly unique position. Mm-hmm. The period of slavery was up in question. The relationship of parents was up in question. And we've uncovered an awful lot of information to lay flesh on the bones. He was a slave. He and his mother, they ran away from slavery. We know that they spent a long time in Quincy in working for a tobacco company. Mm-hmm. There were pieces in there that we didn't quite know. So let's go back. Let's go look at the first time we see.
So where did he escape from slavery from?
From Rawls County in Missouri.
Okay, but he's not originally from.
No. Okay. This is where the story goes.
Okay.
So let's see him. The first time we see Father Augustus Tolton is at his baptism.
Yes, sir.
On the 29th of May, 1854, Father O'Sullivan in Brush Creek Church baptizes Augustine, a colored child, born on the 1st of April on the property of Stephen Elliott, who was a slave owner and a farmer. And the sponsor was Mrs. Stephen Elliott. More on her later. She's the actual owner of Martha and Father Gus. Next time we see him is at an inventory. Stephen Elliott dies, 1863. And they come in, his estate is in arrears, and they search through every item. They bring in an auctioneer, and they literally put a price tag on forks, animals, harnesses, and slaves. This is the next time we see Father Gus.
Okay.
As a young boy, a black boy, 10 years old, named Augustus. And they wrote next to his name, afflicted. More on that. His net worth was $25.
Right.
Now, to put that in comparison to items on the farm, we find also the price tag of a one bay mare horse, 12 plus years old, again, $25. This is very different than a few years before,
right,
because this happens after the emancipation.
Okay.
While it didn't free slaves, as we know.
Right, yes.
What happened was the price of slaves dropped significantly. So when we follow through on the final settlement of this estate, we notice that this is the final proof that the slaves did run away. On September 21st, 1863, Anna Sevilla Manning, or Stephen Elliott's wife, hires a man by the name of Clark and the man who did the estate planning and paid them expenses for hunting fugitive slaves. They paid for stamps and lading. Those were things, posters that you would put up on telegraph poles and so on, saying, look for these slaves. And it said that the slaves had all run away and were out of state. Middle of August is the slave inventory. By the end of September, they run away. This becomes later corroborated by evidence that we'll see in the life of Martha's husband, Peter Paul Lefebvre.
Right. So now we're getting things for certain, right? So we have these things out there that we think happened, but now we have actual confirmation that in fact they did run away. Okay, so they run away and go to where?
They go up to Hannibal.
Okay.
And then crossed over into Quincy.
Okay.
And we know that by some subsequent documents that we'll look at. But this is so incredibly important because this is proof. Now, we're using church records and civil records. These are courthouse records from Riles County Courthouse. When I found this document, I have to tell you, it took me a while to focus my eyes again. It was that moving. Yes, they were slaves, and they were chased. And you know what the penalty would have been?
The penalty is death.
Death or a terrible beating. And the woman that owned them grew up as a little girl with Martha. We'll look at that next. Go back to me. So here we go from Kentucky back to Maryland. Why? Because here's a will by a man by the name of John Manning. And he leaves, you can see Anne and Matilda, these names of the slave owner families, but he gives, I bequeath to Anne Sevilla Manning, now this is Mrs. Elliott as a child, the daughter of my son, this is his granddaughter, deceased, the residue of 360-acre tract, and I leave to Anne Sevilla Manning and her heirs forever, the Negro boy named Charles, this is Martha's brother, and the Negro girl named Martha.
Right.
This family was in Maryland. They migrated to Meade County, Kentucky, and this is where they settled. And Anna Sevilla Manning, when her father died, inherited Martha and Charles.
Right.
But they grew up together. It was common in those days for the African-American children and the owner's children, the slave children, to become friends and grow up together.
Yes.
But she paid slave hunters to chase her friend. So now we move. This is the first baptism records of St. Teresa in Redelia, Kentucky, which is in Meade County. And look at the fifth baptism in the book, 1824, March 27th, I supplied the ceremonies of baptism on a child of color belonging to John Manning. That's Martha.
Okay.
Now, how do I know? Again, the book is new, the community is new, the parish is new. The priest isn't used to doing this. Now we move to the next child we see of Augustus and Matilda. Now, Charles is her brother. And Charles's baptism is 1829, so he's actually 5 years, a little over 5 years younger. So here we of course we see Augustus and Matilda, godmother, servant of the same Maria. What's fascinating about this, and was new to me, and I was really aided by a wonderful colleague of mine to understand this, is that if you were a slave and you were Catholic, you have records that go back that weren't recorded anywhere else. There's no civil record of Martha or Charles's birth. They weren't. Didn't bother to register slaves.
Right. I mean, it's no more than say coming across a pair of shoes. I mean, if you decide to keep the receipt, great. But if you don't have a receipt, when'd you get them? Probably a June or July of 2003. I mean, it's not. A slave is not very important as far as everything goes.
No. The difference in the Catholic experience, though, was they recognized slaves as having a soul and being human.
Yes.
That was unique to the Catholic experience. You don't see that in the Protestant denomination churches at that time. So this whole register has enabled me to build the family. And sometimes you see Augustus and Matilda being godparents, and you can see the relationships. And that matrix I'm working on currently. It's difficult. There's lots of names. Yeah. But it's really fascinating that we see these people in real life at sacramental activities.
Yes.
And if you notice the condition of the books, how terrible they're in, I do a lot of lectures to Catholic dioceses on record keeping, and I often use these and say, you got to put resources into preserving these things.
Well, they're important.
They're falling apart, and they're critically important, right?
So, like, it's one of the few ways you can prove your birth and other things, and that's even today is through your baptismal record. So these are extremely important and important then and now. In fact, very helpful to your cause because
absolutely
you're able to go back and find these records because the church kept them, and now you're further down the road in your research.
It's this part of the story keeps going. So here we have. Remember, we had number 5 from Martha.
Yes.
Now we have number 13. So we're going back in the book. I baptize Anne Sevilla, daughter of James and Polly Manning. This was John Manning's son. He dies. Born on the 1st of June, 1824. Baptized June 18th. A lot more information for the non-slave.
Right.
This woman, who eventually owns Martha, they grew up as children together.
Yes.
They're only a few months apart.
Yes.
It's an amazing part of the story. So, excuse me. Now we go back and we look for. After all the activities in Meade County, Anna Sevilla Manning marries Stephen Elliott, and they move to Rawls County, Missouri.
Okay.
And here we find, again, another estate document of an owner of a nearby farm by the name of Hager. And on his farm, again, they inventory everything. And here we find Peter, the age of 19 years old. And this inventory was done earlier in the 50s. He was 19 years old. And look at the worth at that time. A young African-American man who was strong, who could work the farm. This is Peter, no last name, slave of the Hagers.
Right.
He eventually takes on the name Lefebvre. When he runs away, and then when you look at the timing of the running away, remember the inventory?
Yes.
And then September 21st, she's asking for a credit for slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Lefebvre joins the Union Army on the 20th day of September, 1863. She's asking for credit on the 21st. He ran with them.
Right.
They got to Hannibal. He joins the Union Army, and there were African Americans fleeing the South and in the Free States into the Union Army. And the Union Army, as we know, didn't always trust African Americans or want to give them guns.
Right.
But he dies shortly after, and this is inventory of his effective death. He dies in Helena, in part of the Arkansas Regiment,
right.
on the 12th of January in 1864. He dies of a very common disease in these overcrowded military camps, which was essentially intestinal dysentery. So, he had no effects.
So
he owned
dysentery
nothing.
was the number one killer of the Civil War.
That's right. That's right.
So it's amazing that you would point out Helena, Arkansas. It strikes a chord with me because my wife is from Helena, Arkansas. That is unbelievable.
Well, now, next time you're down there, you can do me a favor.
Yes, sir.
See if you can find a Union Army cemetery attached to an old hospital down there. There was a regimental hospital.
There's not much to do in Helena. That gives me something to do.
Go down to the old courthouse, see if you can find any plans for the regimental hospital, the Arkansas Register.
They actually, as part of their historical society, have the sites important to the Civil War as just sites you could visit. So
you can speed up my research. I'll head down that way if you can tell me that there is a cemetery.
I will
and
definitely
maybe some
look.
records.
That is a wonderful connection.
This is the other directions we got to go that I still have to go. But there you go. Military records, by the way. So we're looking at church records and county records and military records. So Peter Paul Lefebvre, where does he take the name Lefebvre from? He was an itinerant priest, a Belgian priest, who traveled Missouri and Illinois in the 1830s and 40s. And actually, I found his diary at the Diocese of Detroit.
Okay.
And that diary, or journal, had the listings of the Hager farms, not the names, but the numbers of people who were Catholic, who were receiving communion, and the number of slaves who were Catholic and receiving communion. So the Hager farm and the Elliott farm were on there, and the number of slaves is listed. When he was confirmed on the Hager farm, the story was, he took the name Peter Paul Lefebvre, which is the same name of that priest who eventually becomes the administrative bishop of the Archdiocese of Detroit.
Wow.
So, interesting side of the story. So here we look at some of the Hagers being mentioned in sacramental records, and this one is very, very faint, and I apologize for it. But this is Samuel Joseph. Now, I've never seen this, and most of my slave research prep is with one of the better slave researchers in the United States, Dr. Emily Loomis, who is the archivist for the Diocese of New Orleans. And she recently opened up the African American sacramental records, which were closed for so long because of the misogynist laws down there. So it was really interesting that those records have been opened up. And she would help me figure out how you look for things in courthouses and so on. But look at the identification is NIG in parentheses. So the priests were not above prejudice at the time either. This is a Baptist. But this is Samuel Joseph, child of, look, Peter and Martha Lefebvre. This is 1860. Peter and Martha Lefebvre. Martha marries Peter in 1860 in the Brush Creek Church, illegally, surely. And we find that out because documents come to prove it. So this is the first child of Peter and Martha Lefebvre. These things keep opening up. And this is the second child. See if I can find it. I'm sorry, this one's on such an angle. Here we are. John, slave of Stephen Elliott. John, slave of Stephen, child, and Sarah Elliott's the godparent. John Bennett. This is Ben. Okay. So when we see the slaves on the farm, the child that Martha takes with her, the baby, is her child. Okay. That's the second child of her and Peter Lefebvre. Okay. There was never a Peter Paul Tolton. It was Peter Lefebvre. So when do we see Gus again? Well, here we found something new. We couldn't figure out where the name Tolton came from. Right. There was a couple of soldiers by the name of Tolton in the Union Army. Maybe one of them were somebody who helped them get across the river. We don't know. There might have been other Toltons. Right. A good friend of mine, Dr. Loomis, tells me that African American women in particular, but African Americans generally, when they were freed, took on names. Yeah, just more often than not, the owner's name. That happens sometimes. But slave women in particular tried on names the way women try on dresses, is the way she explained it. Right. So we see Martha in census records as Martha Lefebvre. We see her as Martha Thompson. She uses the name Childesley. When Father Tolton, when Augustus Tolton goes to Rome, she takes the name Tolton. None of this is odd. This is just the way that was. But where did he get the name Tolton? And when did he use it? Just before he went to Rome? We couldn't answer this question. But now we have an answer. In June of 1870, in the baptism records of St. Peter's in Quincy, they listed some confirmations, unbeknownst to most of us. And what we found, was in June of 1870, August Tolton is a 16-year-old boy, because he was born in 54, 15, 16 years old. He was confirmed in that parish. So he's using the name. Now, a 16-year-old man, He's starting to assert his independence. At the same time, in 1870, it's Martha and Auguste Lefebvre in the census record, but he, in his own name, is using Tolton. So was he trying on a name? Where did he give it? That's not part of the story we know yet. We don't know what that answer
it's
is.
difficult with slavery because you just don't know. Some people take on some names, other people take on other names, but it's interesting because in slavery you're not given a last name. A last name gives you a place of belonging, a place that you can come back to, and so slave masters didn't want those connections or those traceabilities, so they just gave you a name for identification purposes, but no last name because you didn't have a place of belonging.
So, third time we see Augustus through church records.
Yes.
Confirmed. Behind St. Teresa's, in a field of leaves and trees, is an old slave cemetery. So, this is a fabulous example of the etchings on the stone. It's completely neglected and falling apart, but I'm pretty sure this is where Matilda is buried. And maybe some of the children who didn't quite make it. How do we know that Martha and Peter were married? Martha, after the war, applies for a widow's pension. But here is the actual approval of the widow's pension, and it talks about that she was married to Peter Lefebvre on the 7th day of November in the Brush Creek Church in Rawls County, and that no other children survived. That's how we know that Peter Paul Lefebvre was not Father Tolton's father. Who was his father? We don't know.
Right. I mean, it's slavery. So part of slavery and the difficulty of slavery is that the records of birth and things like that aren't necessarily kept readily. What is kept readily is the record of property, as you've stated before.
That's correct.
And this is all really, really interesting and draws us into the life, like the real life that this man had to overcome on his way to the priesthood. This is phenomenal. This is really, as an African American person, this sums up some of the struggles that we have with identity in this country, but it also shows a triumph. The Catholic Church, while not perfect in this thing, was still willing to baptize and acknowledge the soul of the human. And that's amazing.
But we see prejudice in various parts of the church during that time. As you could see, the one priest putting N-I-G in parentheses after the name. My colleague in New Orleans said she's never seen that before in a record. That's just unique. But faith, what he learned from his mother and his mother's role, growing up as a child, as a Catholic, being given to someone, moved somewhere else, being chased by slave hunters by her old friend who happened to be white and owned her. She was still property. What did faith keep them doing? It gave them hope.
Right.
It gave them direction of where they're going in life. They knew that the reward was at the end. And Peter Paul Lefebvre was a Catholic as well. Augustus, this was the only father he knew growing up. He lived on the nearby farm. Obviously, there's a lot of interaction between the slaves from the different farms. And I still think of him as Father Augustus' stepdad. He did not have a role in his life.
Right.
But sometimes the narrative is hard for people to accept. Well, he didn't have a dad. Well, he did have a father. We just don't know who he was.
Right.
Well, the other side too, as I remember, when he started showing promise in school, the Benedictine brothers and the Franciscan priest, and I think there was a Benedictine involved as well. They tried to continue his education. They made sure he got an education. And then when he got ready to go to a seminary, no seminary in the United States would accept him because he was African American.
Right.
No Catholic seminary in the United States would accept him. What did they do is they sent him to Rome, to the Propaganda Fide. And the urban college, he finished college, he was ordained in Rome in St. Peter Lateran. And then the story was he was going to go to the missions in Africa. And the head of the prefect of the college said, well, America is now embarking on equality. Let's see what they do with a African priest. And he came to the United States. And in Quincy, he ran into terrible racism on the part of another priest who would rail against him because he was a great preacher. People from his parish were going to listen to Father Gus speak and going to him for sacraments, and they didn't like that. So eventually he begged out and was accepted in Chicago, and that's the next part of the story.
Okay.
That's
awesome.
Part of the story.
Like, it's this story and having these facts. I'm a history buff, so just having like factual documents and things like that to point out these and correct some of the things that are out there, some of the things that, we may have gray areas, so we have to subsidize information and have these there and get us to a point where this can be, now we can start to deal in facts.
There's a bit of a Joseph story here.
Yes.
Peter Paul Lefebvre accepted Gus as a son. He
Right.
was close to him, obviously. Didn't Joseph also accept someone as his son?
Yeah.
I mean, the faith of Martha, I'm in awe. I just find that to be fascinating, how she kept her faith through all of this.
Yeah, for me, as a person of color, I've seen a little bit of racism. Nothing like this. Nothing where I'm denied a name or knowledge of who my parents are, or having to run in the middle of the night and hide and everything else. And this shows a tremendous faith. I remember I was reading about his life, and he was bummed out, and at one point, and he basically came home, and he's just, out and down, and he's talking to mom, like young men do, and she pointed to the crucifix and said, they rejected him too. And it's just a tremendous amount of faith that she had, which rolls into him. And I mean, I think it's important that when talking about the canonization of him, we should also look into her cause as well, because, I mean, it would be easy to say, you know what, yeah, I don't know about this whole thing. So
she was illiterate. She couldn't read or write. And how I know that is on her widow's pension, she's making a mark.
Right.
So she couldn't write her name. Do you think education was important to her? Do you think she might have been the guiding hand? Go to school, get an education. And imagine the joy when he came back, ordained as a priest. And the hoopla around the United States was just
and they're probably
fascinating.
Well, Baltimore and New Orleans in particular, very large populations of
African Americans.
Catholics.
Absolutely.
Chicago as well, large community of African American Catholics. So I could imagine what it was like when this man that looks like you shows up and is your priest, pastor, and leads your church, your flock. It probably, Chicago was probably all aglow when he arrived there, correct?
Well, yes and no.
Well, certain pockets of Chicago.
So here's the last document I want to share with you. And This was a recent find. And again, this was one of those, oh my goodness. July 7th, 1890. So this is 7 years before he passes away. He's in Chicago. He's trying to build St. Monica's. He's trying to get the parish together. They're meeting in the basement of the cathedral. They're meeting over at Old St. Mary's, the Peter Claver Society, as they call themselves. This woman who worked as sort of a social worker of the day, and she visits. She works in the Visitation and Aid Society, which is sort of the precursor to Catholic Charities in Chicago. And she writes a letter to Bishop Slattery, who's the head of the Josephite Order, which is an order that was working with African American communities for a long time. And she's talking a little bit about her trip and her time in Chicago. And she says here, in the lines here, she goes, I attended the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Mary's in Wabash Avenue yesterday with Father Tolton's congregation, and had an opportunity of speaking with my good friend, the Negro priest. I thought if he was going on to attend the Congress, the Black Catholic Congress,
National Black Congress, which he was principal in founding and getting on.
Right. I would send my letter to you by him, but he gave me the address. He thought he wouldn't be able to reach you because he said he was feeling so ill. He was afraid that he would not be able to undertake the journey. Remember the 10-year-old boy that they put afflicted by? Right. We know that he had terrible asthma. That was probably something that was involved in causing his death. Poor father. It seems strange, after all the gush we read from week to week in the papers about the dear Negro, he is left to struggle on almost alone, in poverty and humility, grappling with the giant task of founding a church and congregation in Chicago. Eyewitness, all the gush, the news, the oddity, this African-American priest coming back to the United States. But was he getting the kind of support he needed? We who come in contact with him in our labors and are the witness of his ardent charity and self-denying zeal, feel ourselves privileged to bow the knee for his saintly blessing.
Wow. That is a testimony.
You know,
that is a testimony to who he was.
Unrequested.
Yeah.
I found this in the Josephite archives, and I think this speaks volumes to who he was. These were people that there's no rationale for her to prop him up.
There's no
this
game.
Is just wow.
Just a letter from a concerned person.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's profound in that it shows that even in this time, because I mean, even though it's Chicago, big city, there's still enough indifference to go around to really make a person, go stir crazy. But in the midst of that, he's still a beacon of light for many, many people, including this person who is not African American, but just comes to hear his words and is so inspired. So if you wanted someone to walk away who's seen this and to walk away with one or two things, what would that be about?
Overcoming slavery. I think for many people, and not just people who are Caucasian, but African Americans too, have a very... Slavery is bad. It's terrible. People got whipped. The dehumanization of the whole institution is something we have not come to grips with. Right. That's something we need to do. And African Americans don't get it all the time either. I mean, if you listen recently to some comments by some entertainers, it seems to indicate that, it's just a state of mind. It's not a reality of breaking up families, of destroying the recognition as an individual, of the dehumanization. Right. Forget the beatings and the rest of that. Most of us got out.
It's funny that you say that, because there's a book, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, and it's written by him, and it accounts for his entire life, most of which was spent in slavery. And I read a line in there, first line of the chapter, where it talks about he got a beating for a reason unknown to him. And he explained the whips. He said, I took this beating and the blood started to run and the welt started to come up on my back as big as my finger. And I look at my finger and I think, wow, that is brutal. And he was in Maryland, a state which was expressly set up as a Catholic state. So chances are these folks were affiliated with Catholicism. But that's not all Catholics, because we also know that in some aspects, especially the South, Catholics were targets of the Klan because of their stance. And, you know, we get the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is a direct jab at Catholics. So, you know, it's interesting that Father Tolton could remain such a beacon of light after all that he'd been through in his life, and keeping that spirituality, and then not only being able to keep it, but to then espouse it, to let it come out and let it shine and inspire so many other people.
Let us hope Mary Elmore was a prophet. Let's hope this saintly man becomes a saint.
You know, that is the prayer. Obviously, Bishop Perry, who is near and dear to my heart because he was our past chaplain at the Knights of Peter Claver. I got to spend some time with him in 2010. Very profound, leading the cause, and good people like you who are doing this tedious research. As a historian, I know that you can lose yourself in the life of another person when you're doing the research. So that's a big thank you for turning over this much, and then any future endeavors that you have into the life of Father Tolton. And it's just so awesome and awe-inspiring to see this and see someone really, really delve into this important man, not only in Catholic history, but American history.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. And
great talking.
Thanks for coming out.
I really enjoyed the opportunity.
Anytime. And we hope to see you again with more information, more documents, more facts, and we'll love it.
Well, you know, let's look forward to next February.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.